Your 7-string guitar tone sucks. Too flubby, too much low end, doesn't sit right in a mix, too much high end. We're changing that today. In this video, I'm gonna go over every little detail as to why you might think you're not getting the exact 7-string tone that you want, and I'm gonna show you how to get it to sound like this. The reason why you never feel like you can get a 7-string guitar tone is because 7 strings are ultimately just completely different instruments to a 6. Not only do they have an extra string, obviously, but the way that they're made and the certain specs that you're typically seeing on a 7-string, whether it be like a production model or, you know, a really nice one, they're just different. They're built different, they weigh more, they're bigger, the necks are wider, the pickups are usually different, the bridges are usually different, the frequencies and the general sound that these guitars are emitting are not that close to a normal standard 6-string, which is why when you put it into the front of an amp, it's not going to react the same way. And it's worth keeping in mind that, you know, every amp that we love, whether it be a Marshall, whether it be a 5150, whether it be a Mesa Boogie triple rectifier, all of these awesome amps that we love to play through in plugin world and in real life, were never really meant to take frequencies this low. To put it in perspective, I'm using a 70 gauge string right now. This guitar's tuned to drop G sharp or drop A flat. The thickness of that string and the note that it's tuned to is relatively close of something like the 2nd string on a bass. It's low, and this is only really a half step down dropped from what a normal 7-string would be. It's not even that crazy low. I have a 7-string behind me that's in drop F sharp, which is, you know, 5 semitones lower than a standard B on a 7-string. To make sure that you're getting what you want out of a 7-string guitar tone, you need to make sure that the guitar and the front end of that guitar going into the front end of the amp is reacting the way that the amp expects it to, you know? This is why people like using overdrives in the front of the amp. This is why people like using EQs in the front of the amp in some cases, because we want to get the soundscape of this instrument and make it similar to what a 6-string guitar would be and the frequencies that that would be emitting. So that when it hits the front end of these amps that are typically, you know, very old and not made for these guitars, they saturate and they pull and they play and feel the same way that it does when you plug in a standard 6. To demonstrate that, I'm going to be using Positive Grid's brand new Bias X plugin. Positive Grid are the sponsors of this video, and we're going to go over the tone that you heard in that demo song, and I'm going to show you exactly how I've done the tone, everything from the EQs at the front to the EQs at the back and all that stuff to get a really nice in the box sound that barely needs any mixing. So this is the full signal chain of the tone that I've cooked up in Bias X. You can see we have a gate going into an overdrive, going into a boost, going into an EQ. Now, these are all things that are happening before the guitar even hits the amp, you know? So you can see that there's a lot of groundwork that goes into like adjusting how your input of your guitar and your DI goes into the front of the amp so that you can get it to feel a certain way. For the amp, we have the Shadow Mamba amp. Now, this thing's freaking me out a little bit. If you don't know, I don't know if I've ever said this online before. I have a massive fear of snakes to the point that even looking at this graphic is kind of freaking me out a little bit. So let's go to the cab. For the cab, we're using the matched cab. So we're using the Shadow Mamba cab, going into another EQ and then a final EQ after that just to do some touches. Now, going over Bias X as a program, you can see it's pretty intuitive. You know, you've got the preset manager over here filled with a bunch of presets from awesome guys and my friends such as, you know, Josh Ang or Angel Season and Jesse Zaretti. Both very qualified and very awesome production wizards. You then have the gear page. Now this includes all of the different pieces of gear within Bias X and all the different amps that you can choose from and stuff like that. So you can see there's plenty of different options, whether you play clean stuff, distorted stuff, stuff in between, even acoustic and bass, there is some there, along with all of their matched cabs. And you know, if you look at the names, you can get a good idea of what they're trying to mimic, like California 30, or Archon or SLO and stuff like that, along with a bunch of effects, you know, anything from compressors to EQs, filters, pitch, boost, all that stuff. There's a wide array of effects in here that you can place anywhere in the signal chain and really just get weird. Speaking of getting weird, Bias X also has this brand new AI assistant thing where you can basically just tell it what type of tone and it will make it up for you, which I think is really cool. For example, you can be as abstract as you want. Say I want to be like an alien. I want to be an alien, all right? And it will take that for what it is, and then spit out a tone that gets close to your prompt. Do you know what I mean? And from there, you can adjust it. You can tell it, oh, I want more reverb, I want more this, I want more that, and it will do it for you. So if you ever just want to get inspired by something random and not really need to think about it and let this do it for you, this is a really cool way of just, you know, typing a prompt in and seeing what pops out. This is the preset that it generated with that alien prompt, for example. So it's definitely gone for that, you know, more reverby, spacey kind of vibe. You can even attach files and throw in songs and throw in guitar stems, and it will do its best to kind of get that replicated as well. A very cool feature, and at the very least, it can get you kickstarted on a certain tone that you want to get underway. The characteristics within this tone that I'm hoping that you're hearing as I'm playing it, you know, things like tight low end, lots of mid-range, very present, very clear, a lot of diction in the note, and very saturated, but not saturated to the point that it's just gain on tap and kind of sounds like fuzz, you know? All of those things coming together are what I typically go for in any sort of modern metal or metal style tone. And a lot of it has to do with how I treat the guitar before it goes into the front of the amp, which is what you should be thinking about when you're doing it with your 7-string in whether it's Bias X or piece of gear or amp or plugin that you're using. First up, got to have a noise gate. Now the plugin does have an inbuilt noise gate with the learn feature, which is really handy. So it will just like scan your DI and set the threshold for you. But modern metal, I want it to be really tight. I've got the threshold just on halfway. Sensitivity is super high though, and the release is super quick. So again, just super gated so you can get away with all that kind of like, I like that. I'm a big fan of that, and I think it lends itself well to my style of playing, which is why I've got the hard switch engaged on the noise gate as well. Going on to the overdrive now, as you can see in any sort of metal tone, we're not really adding any more gain. The gain is set pretty low, but what we're doing is boosting the front of our DI before it hits the amp, you know, turning the volume up, scooping out some mids, boosting some bass in this case. I think the particular frequency that it was boosting actually sounded quite nice. So I've just boosted that there. I've also got this boost switch on just to get a little bit more saturation out of it, bumping the treble slightly to get a bit more stringiness out of the guitar. And this pedal is actually doing quite a lot for the tone. So if I just play some chugs with it on, and then with it off, you can tell that it's still tight, but it doesn't really have as much kind of push as it does when it's on. And I quite like the sound of it being on. So that's the distortion there. Going on to the boost. Now, this is really cool. I'm not exactly sure what this is trying to model, but I actually did see this get done on a preset from Jesse's already. Jesse, if you're watching this, thank you, because this is sick. To my ears, what this pedal is doing is it's doing quite a significant low cut on my DI before it hits the front of the amp, which is always welcome, especially on a guitar that's low tuned, like a 7-string, right? But it's also doing something very interesting to the upper mid-range, and it's kind of lifting the presence of the guitar a little bit. If I turn it off, you can tell it has way more low end. It's kind of like pushing itself into the front of the amp. It doesn't really sound that great, but when it's on, you start getting that really like mechanical, you know, robotic kind of like, I always say like a robot sucking up bolts kind of sound, right? And that's mainly to do with all the low end being cut and of course, you know, the top end being boosted. And this particular boost at this point here, like I'm not trying to drive the signal any more than it already is being driven by the overdrive before it. I just dialed it in so that, you know, the overall gain structure of it being on and off and how hard my signal is hitting the front of the amp kind of stays relative. So just those two pedals alone being off and then turning them both on, so you can hear straight away how significant that difference is, you know, and it's not to do with adding an overdrive per se. It's to do with what that overdrive is doing under the hood and what this boost is doing under the hood. It's cutting low end, it's boosting upper mids, we're slightly scooping out the mid-range, I've particularly picked like the 1000 frequency of the mid-range to dip that down a little bit. This guitar has a lot of that in it anyway, but again, I just want to clean up the signal before it hits the front end of this amp. And that's exactly what's happening with this EQ before it as well. Now, as you can see, the EQ curve is pretty steep. I'm actually adding quite a lot of extreme low end to the tone. I don't know why, I just thought it sounded quite nice on this tone. We've got a boost, going from 30 to 60, and then when it hits 120, that's where it starts to dip down a little bit, dipping down heavy around 250 and 500. So you kind of get that kind of swoop down there. And that's mostly that kind of like low mid dipping into low end kind of sound, mostly where palm mutes live. And most of where all those low end frequencies that something is like a 7-string guitar would emit are very prominent in. I then just took out some 2K and 4K ever so slightly just to ease up on some of the harshness. And I even did a low cut at 100 Hertz to again, really just clean up the signal before it hits the front of the amp. And with all that boosting and all that cutting and stuff like that, the level was a little bit different. So I did end up boosting the level of my guitar DI a little bit so that it was relative when the EQ was off to when it was on. And you can tell it's a super subtle difference, but it's all those tiny little differences that really make up the tone. And again, we haven't even gone to the amp and cab yet, If I turn these three things off, this tone will be night and day different. That right there, those three moves are the reason why your 7-string tone might not be the way that you want it to be. Those three things affecting the guitar signal before it hits the front of the amp are probably the biggest differentiating factors in what makes a good 7-string or any sort of low-tuned guitar tone to a good one. To the point that when you actually get to the amp, you don't really need to do much, As you can see, gain's at 5, bass is at around 6. I've pushed mids a little bit. I don't know, when I was dialing this tone, I just wanted the sound of mids that day, so I did. Treble up at 6, again, just making it a touch brighter. The master is slightly down just to reduce some of that power amp saturation and get a little bit more diction out of the tone. And then again, presence just boosted ever so slightly just to get a little bit more pick attack and stringiness out of the tone. With the mics, it's nothing crazy, you know what I mean? It's literally two 57s on an SLO style cab. I've got this 57 here much closer to the speaker. I'm running it at 65% mix on this side, and then the other 35% is being made up by another dynamic 57 mic on the speaker that's a bit further away, so that it's getting more of those low end frequencies. That one sounds like this. And then the one that's doing majority of the lifting for the tone is this. So a little bit brighter, and then when they come together, you get this really nice, full, luscious kind of cab tone. And then lastly, we have a little bit of post-processing EQ. Now, when both of these are turned off, the tone sounds like this. And then when they're on, it sounds like this. So as you can tell, again, we're not trying to just EQ the tone into a completely different style of tone. What I want to do is get the best parts of this tone, be happy with it before I've even done any EQ, and then these are just the final touches. I want to hear the same tone. I want to hear the same mid-range. I want to hear the same everything. I just want to hear a cleaner version of what I've already made. With that being said, the changes that are now on this EQ after the cab are a little bit of low end push to get a bit more kind of like realism out of it. I just wanted the sound of that cab pushing a little bit more, dipping some like 250, 500 just to clean up the mid-range a bit, dipping some 4K a little bit just to get some of that harshness out, low cutting at 60 Hertz just to reduce any of that really subby low end rumble, and then doing a high cut at 9.7, which again is pretty high for what I typically do, but for whatever reason, for this amp, I really thought it sounded quite nice. When that EQ is off, versus when it's on, You can hear that when it's off, it's much more top-endy, it's much more fizzy, and that EQ kind of just takes that out and gives you what you're actually meant to be hearing, which is more of the mid-range. And then lastly was just this final touch of EQ. I just wanted to boost 800 and 1.6K just a little bit more. I don't know, I was really feeling the mid-range in this tone for some reason. I just wanted more and more and more, and I wanted to see how much I could get away with. But this will really help the guitar stand out in a mix. I barely mixed this guitar in the full demo song that you heard. The project's in the background here. Really, by the time I did like a low cut and high cut and maybe just like fizzled out some of those really harsh frequencies that you can only really get with like, you know, an external EQ plugin, it kind of just sat in the mix. It was very easy to hear the guitars, and this really isn't doing much, like, and then on. So you can tell it's just that final push, you know? The reason why your 7-string guitar tone might suck is because you might not be doing all of this EQ and front end work on the guitar. If I was to take all of this away and just play with my guitar going into the amp and cab, sounds horrible, right? Even if I just put the drive in the front, it will help, but it won't sound as clean. Once I start putting in all the other elements, you then go from that to this. And that is what I consider to be a great 7-string guitar tone. Big shout out to Positive Grid for sponsoring this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.